Alright, I know this video is late, but check this out. I bought a base. It's been taking up a lot of my time. About a year and a half ago, I made a video that opened with this. Once upon a time, there's a game called Street Fighter, and it fucking sucked. The end. And it's true, the march of time has not been kind to Street Fighter 1. But that video was about balancing video games in a competitive sense and how lots of games, especially fighting games, thrive when their balance is just a bit askew. Not on purpose, mind you, but the strongest balance is often born out of a lack of player choices, and coincidentally, it's the weaknesses a given character has that most thoroughly shapes their personality. Characters being bad, whether on purpose or maybe just in one specific way, can help inform players about what your game is about and why it's special. Imbalanced play can be powerful in game design, like, within reason, but homogenizing the strength of all the characters in a game sacrifices fun for the sake of balance, and this is not a great direction to take if you want people to keep playing. In any competitive video game with asymmetrical characters, victory is predicated on the choices you make. The first and maybe most important of which confronts you before the game even begins. What character are you gonna play? Is your goal to win, or is it to have fun? What if the goal is improvement as a player? None of these decisions are specifically at odds with the others, and often players will leverage what is most important to them in a given situation. In tournament play, a player may pick a character that performs better versus a wider array of possible opponents, rather than just their favorite. But it can still be just as necessarily as fun or rewarding for them. When practicing at home, maybe they'll play a character they're terrible with the sole purpose of improving mechanical skill and deepening their knowledge of the game. Maybe they spend hours practicing and looking for new combos in training mode because they find this fun and rewarding. Maybe they play a character that explicitly allows them to work and practice less. The context matters a lot. All of these decisions are made in the run-up to an actual match, outside of the game's parameters. And while not necessarily made consciously in a "I am deciding to do this" declarative sense, they're paramount in the process. The crux is that these decisions can only be made if you're actually allowed to make them in the first place, and they often require imperfect balance in game design to be present at all. It's as simple as this. Giving players decisions is good, and any game that cares about its player base having fun will allow the player to make meaningful decisions, even if they're ultimately bad or weak ones. Not every game needs to have the same goals, and some games are decidedly built with a more competitive or casual slant, and that's perfectly fine. Some games are big on chance, and some see it as a limiting factor in determining skill, and that's also perfectly fine. And then some games have no idea what they want to be, and drag the player down into a quagmire of if-onlys, and maybe they'll patch it. A gnawing feeling that the good is right there under the surface. What could be is not what is, and that can be truly maddening. Anyway, check out this cute-ass piggy I got. Okay, so the thumbnail's a bit of clickbait. Like headlines, any thumbnail that has a question mark in it can be answered with no. That's it. This is not the worst PvP game, because shit like tic-tac-toe exists. Also, Injustice 1. What's going on here? But Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince fails in its PvP content in some fascinating and at times bordering on what I can only describe as miraculous ways. Errors that have never been made before in the entire canon of interactive media. Breaking new ground in the highly competitive field of making me have a shitty time playing a video game. It's possible that a lot of this can be attributed to me wanting the competitive experience of DQM3 to be something it's not, and I'm new to the series, so maybe I'm the one who's wrong. But every single soul I've talked to who's played the past games said it's never been like this, so I trust them. I suppose it's also possible everyone is lying to me. It's possible everyone has always been lying to me. Before I get too down on it, let's get some stuff out of the way. DQM is a good game, and it deserves your money. The monster models are awesome, and they're full of life, and considering these little guys are the only reason you'd want to play the game in the first place, they did a bang-up job. The Toriyama design philosophy of "I have made the ugliest thing that has ever existed, and tomorrow I will try to outdo myself" grows on you with time, even if it's not normally your thing. Look at this guy. This thing's great. The concept of being able to let your team make their own decisions in the heat of battle opens up a lot of strategic opportunities, and allowing the AI to dynamically change their strategy based on what else has happened that round gives the player a lot of agency in the kind of game they want to play. The talent tree system and a monster's inborn traits allow for endless creativity on the part of the player. You can make your little guys fill basically any role you could ever imagine. You want a tank that's also a supporter? You got it. You want a highly offensive damage sponge? Absolutely. You want the ability to confuse and put your opponent's entire team to sleep with every single attack? I mean, who's the real monster here? But yeah, you can do that. This is the Zombocom of monster games.
You can do anything at Zombocom. Anything at all.
Do whatever you want, man.
The only limit is yourself.
This wildly modular loadout system is the game's main selling point for competitive play, and it is as compelling as it is genius in its design. The dungeons can get a bit samey occasionally, but the puzzles are interesting enough, and the concept of synthing monsters together to make new and more powerful little friends is a game system that I have been enamored with my entire life. This YouTube channel focuses mostly on Monster Rancher, and that game's entire conceit is just smashing guys together. It's all good shit, but it's not all good shit. Environmental graphics are abysmal. It's terrible. This looks awful. 2. It's got some platforming parts that feel like it's 2002 again and the game just shoehorned it in because, well, you're moving in a 3D space. Might as well make some obstacles. Okay, I understand. Press B to jump, hell yeah. Oh. The first fucking jump, I'm in a new area. Alright, we're exploring. 3. Everyone is British.
You smell like him.
And that's about it for the bad. I don't like dwelling on the bad, and there's not a lot of it. But the ugly is up next, and good lord, do I ever love dwelling on the ugly. Toriyama's about the ugly. This whole video is about the ugly. DQM is a game with a ton of random chance elements in its PvP. Like I said off the top, this is not inherently bad. I play a ton of Monster Rancher, and the competitive scene for that game is full of 30% instant kill nukes, so I'm probably more than 99% of people who play games competitively am okay with random elements. But it's all about context. In Monster Rancher, the fights are done with notoriously bad AI, so the skill in the game is raising your monster properly before the battle begins and doing your best to sidestep this with careful planning. Sometimes your monster will bust her out because they got unlucky, and it kinda sucks, but usually the better monsters win more and you go in fully understanding the risks. There is strategy in mitigating bad luck and being able to still pull out the win. This can be done in a variety of ways and feels rewarding to accomplish because there is so much player agency in the run-up to the battle, even if there is none in the actual battle. Letting go of the reins afterwards is part of the process. Come what may. Due to my experience in a game like that, what really sold me on the competitive side of DQM was its hybrid style of AI and player control in battles. But as I soon found out, DQM was not meant to be played seriously. It is first and foremost a casual game that, despite all good sense and decency, tries its absolute damnedest to trick you into caring about winning. The issues I'm about to describe all exist in other games to varying degrees, and most of them don't impact my enjoyment of a game, but DQM has concocted a special potion of the most infuriating and frustrating PvP elements I've ever encountered, and after letting it stew for a while, the results can boil down to this. It is both incredibly addicting and not at all fun. Before we get into the minutia, let me set the tone for the rest of the video. In order to play PvP in a meaningful way and build up your monsters without spending an actual ludicrous amount of time doing so, you need to buy 2 different Day 1 DLCs. That's a good opener, right? Are you surprised to hear that it gets worse? Neither of these add-ons should have been omitted from the base game, and it's almost criminal that they actually expected people to play without them. The Mole Hole allows you to... The Mole Hole allows you to easily scout any monster you've already scouted or synthed, which takes hours and hours off the process of synthing new monsters. And the Treasure Trunks is an item box that gives you new items on the hour, many of which crank up the XP you can get and make the process of leveling up to 100 seamless. It's like they sold you a car with 3 of its 4 doors and told you it's extra for the last one. It still drives. You can get from A to B without any real issues, but like, what the fuck, man? It's the middle of winter. I need that shit. And despite this, it gets more grim from there. Let's first talk about how you play the game and how a match plays out. You have a team of 4 monsters. You can substitute 2 small monsters for 1 large monster, and a large monster gets more inborn traits, can often attack twice or even 3 times in a row, and are much tankier and slower than their smaller counterparts. So that's your team. Those are your little guys. And in addition to HP and MP, which are pretty basic, each monster has 4 stats. Attack. This affects damage of physical attacks. Defense. This affects your damage reduction. Agility. The higher your monster's agility, the more likely it is that you move first. Unlike in Pokemon, where the speed value determines turn order in an absolute fashion, i.e. the faster mon will always move first, in DQM, 2 monsters with similar but not identical agility may trade places acting first. There's a little bit of random chance to it. Agility also increases the accuracy and critical hit chance of physical attacks. Also, yeah, we're going to be comparing to Pokemon a lot because it feels like a pretty safe reference that anyone interested in this game has experienced. Wisdom. Wisdom affects the damage of spells and increases their critical hit chance. There are plenty of attacks in the game that don't scale off attack or wisdom. They scale with level specifically, and the game doesn't always do a very good job of letting the player know what stats affect what skills. Lots of stuff that seems like it's magic based is just its own thing. Also, wisdom might affect one other thing, but we'll get to that in a sec. On your turn, you can set tactics and orders. Tactics are generic advice that you can give your monster, like heal the party or support your allies, where the monster will do its best to apply the given tactic based on what's happening in a current round. If you tell them to heal the party and nobody needs healing, they won't heal the party, for example. And orders are direct choices you make on behalf of the monster, similar to games like Pokemon. Sometimes it's wise to allow the monster to make their own choices instead of issuing orders. Here's a good example. Monster A has Dragon Slash. This skill does double damage versus Dragon family monsters, but it isn't particularly powerful otherwise. If you choose to issue the order to attack the opponent's Dragon monster with Dragon Slash, Monster A will be bound to use it. If one of your other monsters KOs that opponent before Monster A attacks, they will still use Dragon Slash but choose a different opponent, hampering its damage output dramatically. If you choose to simply issue a Show No Mercy tactic and then press Fight, Monster A will likely choose a skill that does more damage in the case that the Dragon opponent is KO'd early. In some past games, a character's likelihood to make a good play without player input was based on their Wisdom stat, and at the time of recording I don't actually know if that's the case or not with DQM3, but it certainly seems like it from testing. Players go back and forth for 10 turns trying to KO their opponent's entire team. In the event of 10 turns passing without a clear winner, a tiebreaker is determined first on number of KOs, then if you're still tied it goes to damage dealt, then if it's still tied it goes to percentage of remaining HP, and then finally if all three of those categories are identical, the game flips a coin and randomly chooses a winner. This may sound like an insane way to determine the victor, but I've never actually seen a tiebreaker go past the damage dealt category, so in the game's defense it's likely not very important. Some of these choices are a bit bizarre, especially with stuff like a possible sliding scale of a monster's ability to play without player input, but it's all pretty standard and it's easy to understand. The really preposterous choices for competitive play in the base system lie ahead still. When you synth two monsters together, the result may be particularly powerful, and the spawn will have these little sparkles around them. This signifies that a single stat of the monster has had its maximum cap raised by 100. This can be immensely powerful for certain monsters, and it's obviously a huge boon regardless, even for monsters that benefit to a lower degree. For example, Gem Slime's max HP is like 300 total, and it's still one of the strongest walls in the game because all of its other defenses are so crazy high. So getting an additional 100 points in HP makes for an obscene defensive boost, and it shores up its main weakness in competitive play, making grinding for sparkles a necessary add-on if you want to win. But the sparkle affects a random stat with no ability to control the outcome, and at only 5% chance to appear at all, it's kinda rough. Divided by the 6 possible stats and you've got a great way to kill an entire day and have nothing to show for it. This is one of those things that has no bearing on casual play, so it doesn't really affect the main gameplay loop at all, but locking in an extremely powerful mechanic behind a wall of constant resetting is enough to make you ignore it entirely and just hope for the best. DQM really enjoys its luck-based elements, which, again, is not an inherently bad thing in game design. It's just that all the luck-based elements begin to compound on each other until it feels like the whole experience is out of your hands. But beyond stats, and thankfully something you have a bit more control over, in addition to base defense, each monster has a wide array of resistances to both each element and status condition. Some monsters have high base stats and bad resistances, some monsters have huge resistances and bad base stats, some monsters specialize in status immunity while others focus on elemental immunity. It's just another way the game does a wonderful job of giving each monster its own identity. This obviously leads to imbalance, but it's inevitable. The number here beside each resistance is the percentage of damage reduced from a particular source. As you can see, it's totally possible to go over 100, at which point the element in question begins to heal your monster when they take the hit. You absorb the element. You can raise your resistances with talent trees and accessories, but often it's a pretty hefty investment. Survivability at the cost of agility or damage output, which are both very important, and becoming completely immune to multiple elements is a pipe dream for the vast majority of monsters anyway. Because a few attacking element types are omnipresent in PvP, like ice, electricity, dark, and earth, those are the resistances most people focus on shoring up. This creates an ecosystem where monsters are built with the strongest stuff in mind, and the monsters that specialize in other types but aren't quite as generically strong end up carving out their own niches. This is a system that has all the hallmarks of a healthy competitive metagame, if it actually worked that way. Ultra Crafties are a subset of monster traits that lower the opponent's resistance to a particular element by 50 whenever the Ultra Crafty monster attacks with that element. This means that the actual elemental immunity often sits closer to 150 and not 100, which is completely out of reach from nearly every monster in the game. So what, you say? Shouldn't there be some way to counter building a hyper-defensive wall? You shouldn't be able to just absorb all incoming damage. And that's exactly how I felt when I first started playing the game. You're as smart as I am. But the issue is this. you're also as dumb as I am. Because say you have a monster with Ultra Crafty Cracker. This lowers all the opponent's ice resistance by 50 whenever that monster attacks. You have a powerful ice attacker straight out of the box and have been given the ability to make sure it gets the job done. You do not have to build contingency plans. You don't even have to have a second elemental attack on hand just in case they're immune to ice. You only have to press the strongest ice attack you have access to and watch the opponent disintegrate. Almost none of the major threats in the meta have a meaningful secondary attack. If you do manage to become completely immune to ice even after the Ultra Crafty debuff, then congratulations. You're probably going to defeat the ice teams and there's nothing they can do about it. Well, not quite, but we'll get to that in a sec. It's a bit of a gamble on their part, but the gamble is essentially that most teams are not able to reliably defend this way without being sitting ducks versus the majority of other teams. Maybe you'll run into a team that completely walls you, but 9 times out of 10 you won't. And counterintuitively, a 50% resistance to an element is not enough. Lowering damage by half versus these attackers does not keep you safe. The strongest attackers in the game will easily get close to the 999 damage cap on every single attack versus any opponent with 0 resistance. And when you can attack multiple times per turn, and your opponent often has around 1500 HP or less, it puts them on a very short timer to find it out. Damage is just way too high, and it forces major defensive investment in any mon that wants to hang around for turn 2, only to still be unlikely to see turn 3. We're going to go over a lot of different things in this video, and there's so many skills and abilities that seem very, very powerful, but the real problem is just that the numbers are too high. Everything is overtuned. The skills that feel like strong and hard to get around, like the personal grudge trait, which stuns and lowers all the stats of any monster unlucky enough to KO it, don't actually end up being that powerful because of how high the numbers on everything else are. I've seen so many people talk about wanting to nerf grudge, and I think it completely misses the point. I think the problem is that if you get rid of grudge, you're gonna have nothing but teams that try to win on turn 1, and like that's just not a fun game. But absurd damage isn't the only issue. Status effects are hideously powerful in DQM. Like elements, all monsters have inborn resistances and weaknesses to each status. And like elements, there are ultra crafty traits that pertain to statuses as well. Battles only last for 10 turns at max, and half of the statuses have a chance to remove a monster from the fight for 4+ turns on a single activation. Like elements, a 50% res to status even after ultra crafty debuffs is not good enough most of the time. Most of the good status skills in the game hit the entire opposing party with a single swing, so even at odds worse than a coin flip, they're very powerful elimination tools. Like elemental attackers, status-focused mons nearly never have a contingency plan. They just press the one status skill they specialize in, and most of the time it works out for them. Here's another example. The large version of Spiked Hair has an ungodly combination of traits. It has Ultra Crafty Confuser. It has Ultra Crafty Sleeper. It has Confusing Touch, which has a chance to confuse with its regular basic attack. It has Sleep Touch, which is much of the same for sleep. And it has Collective Punishment, a trait that takes any single target skill that scales with attack and hits every opponent at the same time. This also applies to regular basic attacks. So every turn the rabbit just presses Fight. It has no skills that require MP, it just uses basic attacks every turn and has a chance to sleep and confuse the whole opposing team on every activation. Just fascinating gameplay. My competitive team has S-Dark, and S-Dark's whole deal is that he's both weak to sleep and has the Sleep Twitch trait. This does a devastating amount of damage to every opponent every turn as long as he's asleep. Spiked Hair teams are generically very powerful and don't really require any thought to pilot. And not in like a DSP whining way. So much of this video is me complaining about stuff, and I'm trying real hard not to be DSP. If you don't know who Darkside Phil is, you're one of the lucky ones. If you know, you know. I'm not gonna get into it. Spiked Hair actually requires 0 input though. It just does the same thing every time, and it's really hard to counter. So much so that even the S-Dark build I put together doesn't beat it every time. Sometimes despite a sleep weakness, he just doesn't fall asleep. There's so much random chance. Sleep, Confusion, and Paralyzation all have counter skills that are meant to punish the opponent for mindlessly trying to spread the status. Tit for Tat is a trait that reflects any status back on the attacker that the defender becomes afflicted with. But the most ubiquitous status effect of all has no such counter, and in a bewildering omission is also unaffected by Tit for Tat. I think the thought process around stun was that since it only lasts 1 turn, was that it was weaker and was meant to be harder to stop. But having a strategy with no real counterplayer agency on the part of the opponent is inherently flawed. Stun is agonizing to deal with in DQM, and almost no mons can build a meaningful resistance to it, and the ones that can kind of forego everything else. Stuff like Sleep can be countered by Reflecting Breath and using anti-magic, but the best stuns are skills that don't belong to any specific categories with countermeasures. Throw in the fact that one of the absolute fastest mons in the game exists specifically to spread stun, and then eventually dies on purpose to buff the rest of its team, and you've got a lockdown status that requires no effort to run, and almost nothing but luck to help navigate around on the part of the defender. With all of these beefy effects and attacks, the power level in DQM is incredibly high. So many monsters feel like they are unstoppable given the right circumstances. So why is this an issue? If everything is overpowered, then nothing is overpowered, right? The strength of everything I've mentioned above is contingent on random chance rolling in your favor. Many monsters can attack multiple times per turn and become unstoppable behemoths if they get their maximum number of rolls. But when they roll the minimum number of rolls, they can feel completely impotent. One of the best healing techs in the game randomly heals 2 to 6 times spread out amongst your monsters. But despite the potential for bad luck here, the max roll significantly eclipses every other healing skill in the game, so people roll the dice. But risk reward in competition is not beyond reproach. It's a huge part of all the most exciting moments in the history of gaming. Hell, probably competition as a whole. Gambling on a big play to pull a victory out of the jaws of defeat is part of the process. You have to decide if the risk of the play is worth it. But that's the context I spoke about earlier. It matters a lot less and it cheapens the entire experience if you don't have to make the decision in the first place. If the game just makes it for you without you leveraging anything at all. What if you just have to press the same button every time? Critical hits are a big part of turn-based games. It's a chance to do extra damage and turn the tide of battle. Being mad about the idea of critical hits in 2024 is a waste of energy. They exist, they're not going anywhere, and often their role as a secondary win condition when something seems impossible to overcome. It's not worth whining about, but in DQM they exist almost entirely to boost the power level of monsters that do not want to make choices. We're not going to get into a lot of math in this video, but there's a few rogue numbers here, so I apologize. Watch your head. You see, critical hits in DQM lower the victim's defense all the way down to 1 and then multiply the damage dealt by 1.5. This results in a terrifying amount of damage, and a single crit can often be game-winning, but spells can also crit, and they function in a much more heinous way. Critical spells lower the victim's resistance to that element all the way down to 0, unless it's already negative, before then doing 1.5 times damage. This means that monsters that have heavily invested in talents to become immune to an element will get smoked for full damage plus 50%. And if a 50% resistance already wasn't enough, then a 0% resistance is surely game losing. This puts the onus on the defender to simply not get crit, a get out of jail free card for any attacker too myopic to try a second idea. This really drives home the idea that the game gives you the opportunity to be creative, but then it whispers in your ear that it's not worth it. There's a talent tree called Perfect Speller which contains the strongest attack spells of every single element. It seems like a no-brainer for most offensive mages as it allows them to play around any enemy. Anything they may be weak to is something you can exploit. But it sees absolutely no play in competitive, and this is because the high likelihood of critical spells on high wisdom mons and ultra crafty is enough to make sure they never have to leave their comfort zone. And nowhere is this more egregious than with monsters who use the earth element to attack. What's really funny about the earth users is that they often don't even have the ultra crafty bonus attached to them. They just swing Kacraggle and hope for the best. You see, Kacraggle is a delayed earth spell that hits the whole team at the beginning of the next turn. Having to wait may seem like a downside, but the main boon of Kacraggle is that you can do nothing to defend against it outside of neutralizing the opponent who's planning to use it before they even attack. It's gonna hit your whole team and you just have to accept it. But beyond this, the monsters who specialize in this strategy have traits that increase their critical spell chance by frankly ludicrous amounts. Since they have no other way to inflict damage on earth immune enemies due to a lack of ultra crafty Kragger, the entire strategy is simply hope for as many crits as possible. And additionally, these monsters can attack multiple times. And additionally, due to the Economist trait, their spells have a chance to duplicate and fire off a copy of the same spell every time they attack, meaning they can use 6 attacks per turn if they get lucky enough. That's a lot of and additionalies. Any of these attributes alone would be pretty devastating, but this is the power level of DQM. Builds that rely on gambling to really pay off are still strong enough to function unless things go comically south. These monsters do not need to worry about earth immunity. They do not need to worry about specific matchups. They don't need to worry about attacking with any other thing. They just press the button and hope it works out. On the status side, they gave a handful of monsters the strangely alluring trait. This is a random chance to stun the entire enemy team for free before they can even act. This is such an obscene mechanic that it's already been nerfed once, and the game's only been out for like 2 months. While not as much of a free guaranteed game winner as it once was, it's still an outrageously powerful trait that has the chance to lock out your opponent with no counterplay. There's also a debilitation counterpart called Rando Panic that has a chance to randomly lower the stats of every enemy at the start of the turn. While this still allows the defender a bit more agency than straight up being stunned does, the debuffs are so powerful that it can turn the entire trajectory of the match on its head. These, and ultimately most team builds, rely entirely on multiple dice rolls to go their way, and if they do, they often win in a single turn. And if they don't, they get to try it again on turn 2. This wouldn't be a problem if the strategy was weak. You go all in on the one thing and hope it works out once in a blue moon. Most games have a technique or a strategy like this, and it adds a lot of personality to the landscape of competitive play. But it becomes a problem when it's the primary strategy. Because the odds are greatly in their favor, a simple gamble in theory is nothing of the sort in practice. You're pulling the handle on a slot machine rigged to pay out more often than not. There's no meaningful player interaction here. The defender just has to hope they don't instantly lose, and the attacker is mostly just hoping for the inverse. So again, context. Gambling plays in these types of games are fine, but when the payout is so high that it's not worth doing anything else, there's really not a show of skill or fulfilling competition. It's just flipping the top card of your deck and hoping it's higher than your opponent's. All player agency and decision making is removed because it's suboptimal to invest in a backup strategy. You just floor it. It's like if you were playing Pokemon with your little cousin and they kept using Hyper Beam every turn. Except in this version of Pokemon, it wasn't affected by type resistances, and it didn't have to recharge. It's just the best attack to press in every scenario. Isn't this fun? Aren't you having fun getting hit with Hyper Beam? You lose to your little cousin in this scenario. This was intended, or not playtested. Which is worse? I don't think it matters. There's one mechanic we haven't touched on yet that really hammers home that you should simply not ever get emotionally invested in competitive DQM. Frenzied state massively boosts the stats of a monster and gives it a guaranteed additional turn. It's supposed to happen more often when a monster is in dire straits, but it doesn't often consider the actual current game state when doling out its divine will. A monster on the team with the advantage who just happens to have low HP might get the Frenzied state bonus and close out things for their team instantly. It's a comeback mechanic that doesn't seem to care who's actually winning and losing. I've won a ton of games I didn't deserve to win because I got Frenzied state and made a huge comeback. And I've also seen the opposite, where I've watched my opponent forfeit after I mercilessly wore them down for 9 agonizing turns, just for the game to add insult to injury and give my monster Frenzy boost for seemingly no reason on the last turn. This type of comeback mechanic could be pretty interesting, but just like everything else in DQM, the issue is the power level. It's just too much of a change. It's often a random chance to just straight up instantly win the game, just like critical spells are often a random chance to just instantly win the game. Just like Strangely Alluring and Rando Panic are just random chances to instantly win the game. Almost every strategy in the game involves a random chance to instantly win the game, and it feels brutal and completely demoralizing to be on the receiving end of that. It's not much fun to win that way either. Despite all these obvious red flags and keep off the grass signs, lots of us still try. And why? Because at the heart of all monster games is the monsters. People may enjoy the mechanics, but what gets them hooked is the chance to play with their favorite little guys. Oh, hell yeah. Hell yeah, I like this guy. In monster games, imbalance is not only necessary for the game to function narratively, it's also nearly impossible to avoid even if you want to. Especially in games with a linear narrative, the whole sense of getting stronger and general problem solving is hampered severely if the little rat you find 5 minutes into the game can compete with every single threat you encounter. You got 500 characters here, and trying to win with your favorites might be a losing strategy. DQM's leveling system is ingenious in that it allows for the strength of a monster to not be limited by their rarity or ease of access. Some of the first monsters you find in the game are the best for PvP, all without feeling overpowered for your regular story mode journey. I cannot stress enough how smooth this game plays in a single player setting. You just have to deal with the accents.
I've got a nose for talent, and I could smell you a mile off. You're a natural, kiddo!
But despite this masterclass in making all the little fellas feel varied and uniquely powerful, they're still the best monsters. They're still the niche monsters, and then there's the monsters that are just straight up worse at their job than the previous two categories. A small contingent of monsters rule PvP in DQM, and that's not to be unexpected. The unexpected bit is why they're strong. The balance issues are not that these monsters are prepared for anything and that they can just outmuscle their opponents on the road to victory. It's that they are legitimately, by design, not prepared for everything. They are prepared for one thing, and the game says, don't worry, that's good enough. They do the one thing very well and almost nothing can stop them. But people do play with their favorites, and they desperately want to use the stuff they feel is the most fun, even if it's, not the best. Most players vacillate between tryharding with the best stuff and then doing their best to have fun in spite of the game, which leads us to the real villain of this story. Dragon Quest Monsters, the Dark Prince, has the single most bewildering and nonsensical ranked ladder system I have ever competed on. When people talk about ranked play in competitive games, they often separate low rank play and high rank play. Tier lists and stuff like that are usually completely inconsequential for low-level players because the matchups and the situations these characters find themselves in at high-level play are completely different. A character might be strong in the lower ranks because it has a win condition that's both easy to understand and execute, but as the opponents get better, that character's potential drops as strong counter strategies and player knowledge begin to develop. But DQM removes that from the equation completely and just lets every team play exactly the same. The problem with the DQM ladder is that climbing in a meaningful way is very, very difficult. You can win anywhere between 6 and 12 points for a win, but you always lose 10 for a loss, no matter who your opponent is. Players often get to a high enough point on ladder and they decide, it's time to have fun. Let me try out a new idea I've had, or now I can bust out my favorite team. And then they inevitably lose points versus the teams that can play themselves. So they drop a rank, or 2, or 8, and then they get frustrated and decide it's time to grind back to where they were with a tried and true team. This creates this bizarre miasma on the ladder where there is no difference in team strength low on the ladder versus in the higher ranks. I'm much more scared of a bronze player piloting a known threat than I am of a platinum player playing something I've never seen before. Occasionally you'll see different teams, but a bronze serpent of the scales team is exactly as difficult to beat as a platinum serpent of the scale teams due to both the relative ease of playing the team and the fact that bronze is populated with people who were gold and platinum yesterday before they lost a few games while trying something new. It's an absurdly frustrating experience, and I've tried really hard to pinpoint why it is, and I think I have. I ran into someone cheating on the ladder a few weeks ago. Basically, it involved manipulating turn order and making sure their guys went first or second, depending on what the best situation was. But it got me thinking, why do people cheat? I'm sure every individual who cheats has their own reasons, but in the context of a competitive ranked ladder, they do it because they want to see their ranking go up without having to actually improve as a player. They either think they're entitled to a higher placement than they deserve, or they just really hate losing and like ruining the fun of other people. The human brain is just wired to be addicted to watching numbers go up. I would never cheat in a competitive game no matter how frustrated I get with losing, because despite my bitching and moaning about how something was bullshit in the heat of the moment, the ultimate goal is self-improvement. The reason I play games is because they're fun, but the reason I keep playing games is because it's fun to get better at stuff. It's the reason I do most things. It's the reason I make videos. It's fun to improve. And just like cheating, DQM has created a perfect storm of conditions to not let me, or you, or anyone else do that. The best teams pilot themselves and are entirely based around random happenstance doing the work for you. Plenty of players have accepted begrudgingly that the way to climb the ladder is to let the game play itself without any sort of player agency. And they're right, but they don't like it. No one likes it. But despite this, DQM has got that spark. It's got potential. So much room to be an outstanding competitive experience. As you do improve and your knowledge of the game deepens, it becomes more apparent that the improvement cannot happen in a way that matters within the confines of battle. It's a masterclass in how to not make a competitive component to a game. Maybe this is all intentional. Maybe this extremely high variance in battle outcomes and a lack of important decision making is exactly what the devs envisioned, and things are playing out as planned. But it's just awful, dude. It's possible they executed a terrible idea with surgical precision, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that information if that's the case, other than stop playing. I'm self-aware enough to realize that anyone from the outside's looking into Monster Rancher could say all this exact same stuff about it. Every meaningful decision you make happens before the battle begins, but it's heinous to allow the idea that it's not that way. Monster Rancher had no intention of being a competitive game. It's a gambling game through and through, and it's just fun to watch your little guy fight salty bet style. But the DQM has this air of strategy around it that just ends up being completely inconsequential. While I was writing this, I went through multiple phases of, well, what if I'm just bad? What if I fundamentally misunderstand the game and the answer's still out there? And at this exact moment, while reading this aloud, I believe with blind faith that there may still be a way to fix this on the player side. But sometimes stuff is just broken. There's quite a few viable competitive teams in DQM. It's not a mess because of a lack of options, but in spite of this. The single player content for DQM is fantastic, and the multiplayer in DQM is fun, but it's not fun if you take it seriously. It's not fun if you care about personal improvement. It's fun if you find your own fun in spite of the systems yourself. What I'm saying is it's fun if you run two pigs in witch hats. I'm endlessly fascinated with DQM as a competitive cautionary tale. It's mesmerizing in its bad decisions and how they all dogpile on each other to become more than the sum of their rotten parts. And I'm sure I'll keep playing, but I won't be subjecting myself to such a deliberately uncompetitive competitive ladder. Having choices in games is important, and the only choice DQM lets me make is whether or not to play it. Hey guys, thanks for watching this. DQM's obviously a mess, right? Everybody thinks DQM's a mess, it's not just me. But I like making my own teams. I like making the double pig team. I love Hambone and the Governor. They're my boys. But yeah, I really appreciate you guys hanging out till the end of this one. It's different than my normal stuff. I'm just really interested in competitive play in basically everything I do. And I couldn't let this go unsaid. It's so fascinating in how broken it is. And, hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you want to see what I'm working on beforehand, I got a Patreon, I got a Discord, we're almost at 1,000 members, and join that, or don't, whatever, you do you. Anyway, thanks guys, I'll see you in the next one.